Thank you, Emily, and thanks everybody. Thanks for being here today on this wonderful day 2 of NISTS 22. Really looking forward to a good conversation here with my esteemed colleagues. We will be answering your questions, and we will be trying to get some good information out. I have with me today, and I'm going to just run them down quickly and then let them introduce themselves. We have Stephanie Foote, the Senior Associate Vice President for Teaching, Learning, and Evidence-Based Practices at the Gardner Institute. We have Dimpal Jain, the Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies at California State University, Northridge. We have Kimberly Lowry, the Director of Leadership Initiatives at the Aspen Institute, and Rose Rojas, the District Director for Curriculum and Transfer Articulation of Maricopa Community Colleges. I'd like for each of them, I'm going to go down the list one more time and have each of them introduce themselves, tell them a little about each of them, and why transfer has become sort of a core part of their professional portfolio. So Stephanie, would you like to lead us off?
Sure. Thank you so much, Mike, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to be with all of you today. I'm a little uneasy about the word expert because I don't think of myself as a transfer expert. I am, though, a passionate advocate for transfer students, and I have been since I was a transfer student myself. Mike mentioned to you my professional role at the Gardner Institute, but I also have the very proud identity of transfer student. And before I came to the Gardner Institute, I was also very actively involved in a lot of transfer work, transfer orientation programs. I also created a transfer student learning community and did a lot of other things focused on transfer. And now I work very closely with faculty and staff who are supporting transfer students. So it's a passion that I've been able to continue with. And I'm so delighted to be a part of this wonderful esteemed panel. And thank you again, Mike, for the warm welcome. And I look forward to your very thoughtful questions.
Sure thing, Stephanie. Next, Dimpal, if you would.
Good morning, everyone. I'm the West Coaster. My alarm is usually set for 8:30, so I am here bright and early for you. My name is Dimpal Jain. I'm faculty at Cal State Northridge in Ed Leadership and Policy Studies. And the way transfer has become a core part of the work that I advocate for and I advocate with is just due to my practitioner roots. I started 20 years ago working at a community college, Seattle Central Community College. I saw someone was from Pullman, Washington in the chat, so that was exciting. And I just saw the most dynamic, most amount of flavor possible from transfer students, right? I have such a strong respect and also just strong admiration for everything that transfer students do and what they represent. And I'm just really happy that I've been able to continue that work through my research and through my practice. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. And next, Kimberly, Lowry, Kim? You're muted.
You would think, right, after all this time, but good morning. My name is Dr. Kimberly Lowry. I currently serve as the Director of Leadership Initiatives at the Aspen Institute, specifically within our College Excellence Program, where I lead our Rising Presidents Fellowship, New Presidents Fellowship, and work with our alumni work and a little bit getting able to work with some of the Aspen Prize winners. But prior to this role, I served as a scholarly practitioner for over two decades, most recently as the Vice President of Instruction and Student Services at Lone Star College, Houston North. In regards to just my background with transfer, I think like Stephanie, I am a proud community college graduate. I have an identity as a transfer student. I've researched and studied transfer students. So having that lived experience and having been in the community college as an executive leader for so many years, transfer is so important to me. I'm excited to share space and just continue this conversation about how we really can continue to support transfer students. So thanks for having me.
Great. And last but certainly not least, Rose Rojas.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Rose Rojas, and I'm the District Director for Curriculum and Transfer with the Maricopa Community Colleges. We're located in Phoenix, Arizona. I've been working in higher education for about 26 years. The majority of that time, I've been working with transfer and university partnerships. And like many experts on this panel, I too was a transfer student. And like most professionals, I kind of backed into the profession or fell into it. And so when I learned that I would be advocating and actually helping advance the work for transfer students, I was really excited. So my specialty that I like working with is academic policy. So really looking at the policies to remove those barriers for transfer students. It's great that we provide, support services and that we really engage transfer students, but I think that we can't forget how policy impacts equity regarding transfer students. So I'm very excited to have this conversation today.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Well, without further ado, as I've said, we've got some questions crowdsourced to start us out, but please do add to the Q&A questions about of anything that may be on your mind, but we are going to be focusing on a few particular areas first. But my first question is to you, Stephanie. And the question is, especially with your expertise in teaching and learning, here at NISTS at this conference, we find ourselves with this incredible learning opportunity with our friends and colleagues in transfer. We get so many good ideas from our colleagues at conferences like this and other times that we interact. How can we better incorporate these good ideas into our day-to-day practice?
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate this question very much. It's something that, I find myself that I'm thinking about all the time as I'm involved in these various professional development opportunities. And NISTS has been a bit of a professional home for me over these last many years. I have benefited greatly from the different conferences and the publications, the opportunity to publish as well. So there are a lot of different ways to take the learnings and apply them in our own professional practice. And I think that my big takeaway is always, and this is the advice I give myself, to take away one thing that I can do immediately, one thing that I can do, in 6 to 9 months, and then one thing or more that I might do in the next couple of years. So to have a real intentional plan. And I remember many years ago now, when I attended an NISTS meeting, I was really inspired by the work that was happening around development of transfer student learning communities. And it inspired me to go back to my institution at the time. I was at Kennesaw State University and create a transfer student learning community. And it took a little bit of work on my part because at that point we didn't really have any dedicated transfer programs other than transfer orientation, but we had a really successful learning communities program. And so I started really small, just, working to link a transfer student seminar that I created with an existing course, psychology course that a lot of our transfer students ended up taking because many of them didn't have it when they transferred. So that was just a very small step. And it was something that I was inspired to do from NISTS. But from there, then, I used a lot of the learnings to grow that and to develop some other supports that were eventually embedded into this. And ultimately, this transfer student learning community became a much bigger program that was funded by FIPSI First in the World grant. And so we received at the time $3.2 million to expand this project that started literally from an idea at NISTS, where I turned to a colleague who was sitting in the same row with me, a very good friend of mine. We're still very close, even though neither of us are at Kennesaw State anymore. But we turned to each other and said, could we do this? We could do this. Let's do it. And at the time she was in orientation and I was in an academic department, but the partnership that we had and this endeavor, this passion that we had, we were able to really grow that. And we were able to bring on other colleagues who have the same sort of passion and enthusiasm for transfer students. So I think, just like James Lang, encourages us to take small teaching approaches, and I encourage faculty and myself in our own teaching practice to implement, one small change, I would advise the same thing. As you're learning about all of these wonderful, awesome things, record all of them, take notes in any way that's appropriate or comfortable for you, but think about the one thing that you could do immediately, and maybe even think about someone that you could partner with in that endeavor. And then from there, plan out how you might approach some other bigger tasks based on the kinds of things that you're learning in this professional environment. And lastly, I would say also make sure to make those connections. I know sometimes in a virtual environment, as we're at these conferences, it's wonderful because they're more accessible often to us as professionals, but at the same time, it can make a little bit more challenging those networking opportunities. But there are, of course, many built-in opportunities that NISTS has created for networking, but I think also taking advantage of, the connections that you can make through the chat in these sessions and through the Q&A, meeting some of the presenters and other colleagues. So I think that that's also been very fulfilling for me in my own professional development, because often transfer professionals are an N of one. If you even are an N of one, it may just be something that's added on to your other professional tasks. So it's really important to create those networking opportunities and to stay connected to each other. I think that's it, but thank you. I could go on.
Wonderful, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Anybody else? If anybody else want to weigh in quickly, or do you want to? We can move on.
I do, Mike, just really quick. So I love that response. I think the other thing I would add that was helpful for me is sometimes we have access to those PowerPoints or little handouts. So I would find myself also, if there was a flyer or a handout or an infographic that could easily be applied at my institution as well, bringing that back as an example, right? So I think to Stephanie's point, think about what you could do immediately, but also think about those tangible items that could make a difference at your institution. That way, when you come back and share, you can share an actual example of what it could look like.
Great, wonderful. Dimpal, you probably figured you're getting an equity question from me. We talk a lot about looking for equitable outcomes and data and things along those lines. But how do we make sure that when we're looking for data to support equity, that we're asking equitable questions? And how do we know that the data we see actually means something instead of just being numbers or observations?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mike. It's a really, really good question. And I think just like questions to most data, there's not one answer, right? And I would say the first thing to do is to really examine your own researcher identity, right? Know that you're not coming to the data, you're not coming to research as this neutral, objective vessel, right? You have your own lenses, you have your own experiences, you have your own preconceived notions, right? So what is it that you want to first examine about yourself and your practitioner identity and your scholar identity as you begin to look at the data, right? As you begin to ask these questions, where is your stance on things? And then how can you also help frame and challenge, right? How can you help frame the data that you're looking at? I've learned so much about framing and how if you literally just change the frame from the picture, you look at the picture completely differently, right? So what are your frames? Are you looking at this from a feminist lens? Are you looking at this from a critical race lens? Are you looking at this from a critical theory lens, right? Those frames around the data really matter when it comes to equity. And then to also set your intentions, right? What is your goal? What is the question that you're actually trying to answer? And I think when we get into data, we get really distracted with like shiny things, right? We get really distracted with the outliers. We get really distracted by a pattern we didn't particularly begin our search with or for. But that doesn't mean that that's where all your attention goes. You should absolutely consider it, absolutely put it into consideration, but still to remember your purpose and to remember what question you're trying to answer. And as far as the significance and reliable question, I would say How many different types of data are you looking at as well, right? Is it just numbers? Are you looking at observations? Are you looking at essays? Are you looking at focus groups? Are you looking at different forms of data to make sure that the numbers have context, right? How do we make these numbers breathe? How do we make these numbers live? And then the last way that I know that I'm asking something that makes sense, right? Or in terms of just being really kind of plain speak, is I'll ask my family. I'll ask people that are outside of academia, right? Like, hey, I have this issue at work, right? We're having this problem where a certain number of students aren't graduating. We know it's us. We know it's not them. If I ask these questions, does that make sense to you, right? And my family is very, very quick. My friends are very quick to put me in check and be like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? Or, well, why did you ask it this way, right? Or can you also ask this, right? So I think we often forget our influences outside of academia, even if it is an academic issue. I think it's really important to vet when we come to equity. I think that's all I have for now.
Great. Thank you, Dimpal. Okay. Let's see, where are we here? Okay. So Kim, with the student success work that you're doing at Aspen, say, knowing that we see institutions dealing with competing initiatives like focusing between growing recruitment while increasing retention and trying to integrate transfer students into that picture, how might admissions offices and student success offices partner to better attract students who will thrive in whatever institutional context?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mike. And I love it because it's really asking us to think about admissions, which is really dealing with our prospects, right? And then student success or student affairs, which is once the students get in. I think my first reaction, and I'm sure Dimpal will appreciate it, is who are your students, right? Look at your data, right? So do you know the top 10 institutions you're getting students from, or if you're a community college, where are the top 10 institutions that your students are transferring to, right? When you look at that data, you can disaggregate that by race, by gender, by majors and programs. Kind of ask yourself, if you know where the students are coming from and you see the trends around the majors and programs that they're transferring into, do you have articulation agreements with those colleges, right? Have you thought about the partnership you have? Is there an opportunity to create a more comprehensive program, whether that's something like Valentia's Direct Connect, right? Or where there's guaranteed admissions, there's dual advisors in both institutions. I also think we have to ask ourselves, how are we highlighting the work that we're doing? I had a group conversation yesterday and we heard about some really amazing efforts to support transfer students, whether that's a transfer center, a transfer hall, mentorship programs. Do these prospective students know about that, right? Do they know that they're valued and seen at your institution? More importantly, does the staff know, right? So I can think back to even my time at Lone Star, and we made it a point to make sure we had reoccurring meetings between recruiters and advisors, right? Do we know what the recruiters are sharing? Have we really equipped our recruiters with the information to share the great things that are happening at the institution? And even to drill down further than that, how are our faculty engaging with our recruiters and advisors? I think one of the biggest things, and Rose mentioned it also, is how are we telling our story and how do you incorporate students into that, right? So do we have other transfer students that can speak about their lived experience? As a transfer student, I want to know that I matter, that my credits are going to transfer, that I have a place at your institution. So I think we ask ourselves, one, are we sharing that? Are we sharing why this institution is a place that we think they belong? And if we are, how good of a job are we doing, right? Is that message being clear? Is it out there? And if we're not, how might we think about sharing that message, right? Because I think a lot of it is about information, it's about awareness, but at the same time, when I think about those two groups, admissions and say student success, they also have to be on the same page. I wouldn't want a recruiter or admissions to promote an experience that then a transfer student doesn't receive when they transfer, right? Or vice versa. So I think it really is important for those two areas to be in regular communication, for us to share resources and share what that experience is for transfer students, not just through application, but once they get into our institution so that they can be retained.
Thank you, Kim. And I would also, and I feel like I'm going to weigh in on this, because this was really this was one of the theses of the book when we were putting it together that Emily mentioned, our transfer experience book, was the notion that a transfer student's experience starts at the minute they walk onto a campus, and it doesn't end until a student walks across the stage and gets a baccalaureate degree. And it is wonderful to think about, and I think that's thinking about how something like admissions and student success can partner. I think that is absolutely vital, because again, as these students are moving through their academic career, their academic experiences, they really, we have to think about each stage of the process. It's all interconnected for these students. They see it as all, they see their experience as all one experience, or we're just like, well, this is where you move your credits. And so I challenge ourselves to think about the holistic student experience as we're considering these sort of partnerships.
Yeah, I love that, Mike. And I think you touched on the point that they have an experience as well, right? I think a lot of times we assume because they're a transfer student, possibly transferring in at junior status, all the time and effort we put into a native student or a first-year student persisting and retaining, we assume, oh, the transfer student may not need that because they've already completed their first 2 years, right? So we see that by a difference in orientation, a difference in an experience, a difference in the support services. So really asking ourselves, again, to your point, they are still a student, they still need support, they still need access, they still need resources. So as an institution, how are we still supporting this student population?
Great. All right, and Rose, I'm throwing PLA at you. A question for you surrounding, yes, not surprisingly, prior learning assessments allow us to award credit for life experiences. What objective tools currently exist that can help ensure consistency amongst awarding this kind of credit that still upholds the learning process that's thoroughly reviewed in an accreditation process? And also, is there a type of alternative credit, if we're just getting started in that realm, that we should prioritize?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. There's a wealth of information out there in terms of, we don't have to recreate the wheel. There's publications, national resources that have been created that are faculty-based and faculty-driven that we could use to make those type of decisions. But I just wanted to take a step back first in terms of why prior learning assessment is important to the transfer agenda. And that's because of the student journeys changing. Students are bringing learning achieved elsewhere outside of our institutions. And so it's very important. I keep saying that it's the next evolution of transfer, is really being able to create that infrastructure to seamlessly bring in and being able to recognize and document and verify that learning. So really not talking about life experience, but we're talking about, anywhere from standardized exams to military credit to industry recognized certifications. Again, a wealth of resources out there to be able to verify, document, and recognize that type of credit. But we do have the most, how would you say, the excellent resource or the experts at our institutions, and that's faculty. So we really at Maricopa rely on our faculty to do the assessment. So whether it's transfer credit from a regionally accredited body or transfer credit from a nationally recognized entity, we provide the documentation to our faculty experts, and they do the evaluation and the assessment, and then they determine whether or not they accept and apply the credit. And so I had an idea a few years ago of, it would be great to have an open resource tool to be able to go in there and access challenge exams or assessments that have already been created from institutions, and that they can, dedicate it to this open resource tool so that others can either adapt it or use it as templates. And so that would help us with the conversation about how can we advance prior learning assessment to help transfer students and meet them where they're at in their journey.
Right. I have a question here, and I'm just going to throw this open to all of us, from one of our one of our audience members, and it is this. And I see this question, and I'm going to bite my tongue at the end of this. But at our institution, it says this is from one of our audience members. At our institution, we do not allow new transfer students to register for courses until after they have completed new student orientation. However, the first new student orientation for transfers always happens at least 2 weeks after current students can register for courses. Some feel that current students should have priority for registration. Others feel that transfers should have the same opportunity to register on time for courses as current students. What are your thoughts? Anyone want to weigh in on that?
I can get us started, and I'm sure my colleagues on the panel will jump right in. I would say that this is not uncommon. I see this a lot. I've even lived this myself as an orientation professional many years ago. And I think it's a fantastic question. I would say, obviously from my gut, that this is a very inequitable policy, because we know that transfer students are coming to us with many different credits and different needs. And in the best case scenario, we would create registration experiences and orientation experiences that are flexible and that meet the students where they're at, and holding them to registration that occurs after the other new students. So maybe after current students, I'm sorry, it didn't say after the first year orientation, but after current student registration, unless we're holding seats for them in specific courses, can put them in a place where they're very vulnerable because they can't get the courses maybe that they need and or at the times that they need. And so they should have, in my mind, priority when it comes to registration. And I would encourage you to consider what it might look like to have registration opportunities, maybe some drive up, so to speak, virtual, in person, whatever is appropriate registration opportunities, and then have some sort of orientation experience for your transfer students. So that way they're not put at a disadvantage because they can't register when your other students are registering, your current students. So I think it's important to consider what opportunities there might be and how students may be disproportionately affected by these policies and or practices that are restricting their registration time.
Yeah, and I agree. I would add to that. I think to Stephanie's point, it's not uncommon, right? A lot of times we see that registration opens for current students even before new students, whether you're transfer or not. Just a new student typically is able to register after. I think, again, my first question would be how many students are being impacted, right? So if we are getting feedback from transfer students where it is hindering their ability to register for classes, at the end of the day, we know that enrollment drives a lot of our practices, right? So from a logical perspective, it may be perceived easier to get current students to enroll and incentivize them enrolling early to retain them versus whether or not a new student can come in and register. But again, if your data shows you have a group of students that, if given the opportunity to register 2 weeks early, would be ready, I would hope that any administrator would consider that and review that in an impact, right? So again, I think Stephanie said, I would want to sit in that a little bit and determine what is that impact, what's happening by those 2 weeks, us preventing new students and or transfer students from enrolling, and quantify that and share that and say, again, if you had 500 transfer students that were ready, all wanting to register, say full time, think about what enrollment and head count that does for the institution, right? But I think being able to sit a little bit, and when we're talking about changing policies, again, there's that book, Becoming a Student Ready College, right? So thinking about that and unpacking that, Are we creating policies or practices that are more our preference or that makes it easier for us? Or is that hindering the student's ability to advance and complete their goals? And I think the data can help you at least understand and have a level of advocacy when we start to talk about policy or practice changes.
I also think that if you see, I mean, I think a situation like that is a glowing example of the inequity that is visited upon transfer students on the regular. And I think that identifying something like that and coming up with, seems like it's a good opportunity to look at other places and other policies, other practices that may have evolved, perhaps not because of some malice towards transfer students, but really that is the outcome, is that it is keeping transfer students from working on a level playing field with those students. So it's a good idea to then I think sit with, that gives you an opportunity to then look at the processes that have been set up to make necessary adjustments as needed. I think it's a good, something like that can be a really good place to start a dialogue. And I will, because we have, and that actually jumps really nicely into, where did that go? Oh, did you answer that already? sorry, folks. That's one of there's a question here directly for Rose. It says that Rose says she works with policy. Can she give an example of a policy that affected transfers and how she addressed it in her work? So nice. There's a segue for you.
Yeah, so I'm very excited and passionate, especially about changing policy to open the doors for access for transfer students. So one specific example is back in 2016, I did the research and worked in changing the policy. Prior to that, Maricopa, the community colleges, only accepted credit from regionally accredited institutions, our peer accrediting bodies. And so what I did was did the research and then provided the evidence and was able to change the policy to now create an equitable evaluation process for both regionally accredited coursework and nationally accredited coursework. And many of you are aware that back in November of 2021, the U.S. Department of Education really changed their definition of regionally accredited bodies to nationally accredited. So basically they said that as long as they're recognized by U.S. Department of Education and CHIA, that we should be evaluating coursework from those accrediting institutions or those institutions accredited with national accreditation. And so really working with the policy, we were able to create that equitable evaluation process because we didn't think that blanket credit denial was inclusive and it wasn't fair. So if we're talking about, diversity of learning experiences, and if we're talking about creating equity, it's really going down in the policy to see how it's impacting students. And so if you're isolating one population of students, then that's not right. And so you need to try to advocate in terms of how can we do this? How can we provide the evidence, the verification, and the documentation in order for us to ensure that we're doing what we need as an accredited institution. And so that's just one way that you could change policy. The other was the prior learning assessment, is really evaluating your infrastructure to see whether or not you can support and recognize effectively prior learning assessment, and what are those policies around that. So are there limitations? Are there restrictions? And then figuring out solutions on how you can, again, create access using both recognition of all transfer credit and prior learning assessment.
Thank you. And I have a question here from Urban Promise Charlotte, who says, I work with 120 students who attend community college and are interested in transferring. We are new to supporting college students, and our transfer population is growing each year. I have the benefit of supporting them outside the walls of an institution. I can sit and have dinner with families, and I know their stories. There are so many institutions in attendance here. So how can community organizations support and partner in ways that amplify the work being done on campus?
I think I can get us started. So again, I think if going back to your area, right, and knowing which colleges are in your area or within your reach, typically we are not going to pass down help, right? So I think that in itself is a great opportunity to talk about the fact that we're serving the same student, right? I'm always about more resources for our students. So I think understanding the services you provide and how to partner, I mean, I think you do have some regulations depending on, you know, whether it's FERPA or things like that. But I mean, at the end of the day, we're going to provide resources to our students. You may have the ability to have a larger footprint or a reach that I can't as a higher education partner. I think it's understanding what resources is out there and how we can work together, right? You may start small with just one institution, whether that's us just providing resources or sharing opportunities, but I think the conversation needs to happen, right? So if you're already seeing an opportunity to collaborate, I think the first step I would do is kind of make my short list of who I want to be able to reach out to and talk to, share information about your services, and identify together what are some ways that you guys can partner and collaborate. Because at the end of the day, the goal is still to put as much support and resources in front of these students as possible. I've also shared too, I know we're putting in some great resources and links again. So selfishly, the Aspen Institute has a lot of work around transfer. When I was a practitioner, I actually used the transfer playbook and designed a really solid transfer initiative at my community college with a local four-year institution. So again, look at some of these resources that are in this chat, regardless of if you're a community-based organization, nonprofit, 2-year, 4-year, but there's tons of resources out there related to really supporting and realigning the work we do with transfer students.
I think I can add a little bit to that as well. You're right, Kimberly, we're never gonna like pass down any additional support or funding or anything that helps our students reach the goals that we all have together. My only caveat would be to also make sure to communicate your long-term vision as a community partner, because I feel like so much as sitting on the other side at the university, we see a lot of these intervention efforts as short-term and short-lived. And a lot of it has to do with us and the institutional barriers that we can put up to receiving support. So as community orgs want to partner with universities and community colleges and different forms of institutions, I would just encourage that community partner to have like a multi-step timeline in terms of how their support can extend over a lengthy amount of time.
This is really for, and since we have a lot of folks here who probably could use a boost. Here's a question for, this is for all of us, I guess. Is that the teaching, learning, and basic living conditions of the pandemic, sky-high college costs and debt, and misinformation about things like critical race theory have thrust higher ed into yet another moment of public scrutiny and disdain. Facing these challenges on a daily basis for generally low pay, all while managing the physical, emotional, and financial effects of the pandemic in our own lives can be draining, to say the least. What would you say to folks who are questioning whether working in higher ed is still worth it?
Such a softball question.
I know.
I
Rose,
was
go
just
ahead.
thinking the same.
Well, obviously it's still worth it. I do think that we do have to take a hard look at ourselves and our institutions, right? And to see whether or not we are serving students. Or are we just reliant on traditional practices and that legacy that we've had and that we ground ourselves in? And so I think it's important, again, to evolve and to really understand what students bring to the table. So coming from more of an asset base as opposed to a deficit. Many years like prior, we always assume that, students were deficient and they needed something, prior to entering into our institutions, as opposed to really honoring and recognizing what they bring to the table and then building on that. So that's the reason why I'm really passionate about prior learning assessment, is because it does offer that opportunity. And so we really just need to kind of embrace our new reality, which is there's competition, and it's from non-education post-secondary institutions. There's content providers out there, alt-ed providers, there's employer issued certification. So really trying to figure out how higher education can play a role in that and be able to create access, leveraging that learning no matter how it's achieved.
Yeah, I love that answer, Rose, and the question, Mike. First I had to take a deep breath once I really listened to the question and read it. But I will tell you, I think two things that come to mind. One, when we look at just data across our country, and I'll use my service area in Houston specifically, there are still so many people that are living in poverty, that are unemployed, that this pandemic illuminated some of the challenges that we were already facing, right? And I think, as higher education professionals, I think we believe in education, right? We know the difference of a credential, or what we hope to be the difference in these students' lives, and not just them, but their families' lives, with them achieving educational goals. And ideally, obtaining jobs that are higher than a minimum living wage. So when I think about that and the sense of responsibility, while I know it is hard, and I appreciate, I'm going to attend the plenary today about protecting your peace, because it is so important of making sure we're okay. But I also ask myself, if not me, then who? Right? So I do have a sense of responsibility, I think, as an educator, as a scholarly practitioner, recognizing the privilege that I have with my credentials, with my jobs and opportunities, to continue to get in good trouble and fight the fight, recognizing that there are so many other people that don't have the access, that don't have this privilege, but truly need it just to survive, right? So again, coming from the community college space, looking at our communities, this pandemic, and before the pandemic, it was bad, right? I think for us, it really showed us how bad it was and how much of a responsibility as college and educators we needed and have to have with the communities we serve. But then I asked myself again, if not me, then who? And I think practicing self-care allows me to keep the fight going on, but my why is still the same, and probably even more important now than ever, given the conditions of our country.
Great. And honestly, and I'm just going to throw in a small thing here. This is, and again, I know we talk a lot because this is true. We're in this because we like to work with students and student services, and this is our chosen area. But just personally, I mean, there are not many environments in the workaday world in general where we get to, on a consistent basis, work with a lot of very smart people who in general have very good intentions and who want to see each other succeed. We're not generally working to try to raise a stock price, and we're not trying to increase dividends and whatnot, but we do have a real sense of community. And that's one of the reasons I've always loved coming to this conference too, is that it's a good reminder, even when things get a little heavy, that there's a lot of good folks doing good work. And for me, that really is personally a reason that I like coming to work. Well, let's see what else we got here. Any other thoughts before I throw another one out there?
No, but Mike, I'm looking at the questions, and that one by Christine Hubbard, I appreciate, and I wonder if we can talk about that a little bit.
Sure thing. Sure thing. So Christine Hubbard asked a question. Inherent in the question about registration priority is the assumption that courses students need will not be available for everyone. Would that not be a signal that the institution should revise course offerings based on student needs to ensure students can progress through their programs?
So the reason why I love this question is going even back to our initial question. Oftentimes we think about admissions and student services, and we don't talk about faculty and instruction, right? So I say that because you're absolutely right. At the end of the day, if that's really why that practice is in place, it should drive us to say, should we not just offer more classes or understand the trends in our course offerings that would allow more students to register, right? So, I mean, I think, again, as we talk about this and we unpack it, that goes back to being a student-ready college. And I think that goes beyond just transfer students, right? So many times we roll over a schedule, we offer classes at the time that a faculty member may prefer versus the time that a student actually needs. While I don't want to assume, I can say, speaking as a previous or former transfer student, I didn't live on campus, I worked. So my time was very valuable, and I needed specific times, or I needed to know ahead of time what my school schedule was going to be so I could talk to my employer, right? So this incentive of being able to register as soon as possible would have been huge. But I think it also it begs the question about just looking at our schedule and acknowledging if we need to sit and analyze the same way we talk about student data, course offering data, right? Are we offering the classes that students need to complete their credential on time? And if we're not, what are we going to do about that? So I appreciated Christine's question, and hope that that's a aspect of transfer and really just the student experience that we can also feel comfortable talking to our instructional partners about.
I could jump in here and just add to what Kim has said. I agree with everything. It's just so many great points, Kim, that you've made. And I would say that too, one of the things that we have to do systematically that we don't do is to map the curriculum. So we understand where the blockers are for students, all students, and especially transfer students too. We need to be looking, even if we have some relationships with our institutions that are feeding transfer students to us, those larger feeder institutions and programs, then we should be mapping these curricula together. So looking at that pathway and understanding what it looks like to transfer from one institution and one program to another institution and program. But at the very least, we should be mapping our own programs. And that's when I see a lot of aha moments when we go through this exercise, because that's when people realize that, course availability, course offerings, course scheduling, that's really creating inequitable outcomes for all students, and especially for transfer students. So I think that it's hard work, but it's important work, and it does rely on those instructional partnerships that Kim just mentioned. We've got to partner with the faculty and other instructional staff that are planning these schedules and offering the courses.
Great. This is I think an interesting question here. What best practices are necessary to build campus-wide support to become a more transfer-friendly institution? This being, it sounds like, being the inaugural 1 year in transfer student service from a transfer student services department who's just getting off the ground.
I think it's important for an institution, and we created, and I think it might be a resource on the NISTIS website, but it's to do a self-evaluation, to do a self-assessment, and really take a hard look and examine your practices to support transfer students, your policies related to acceptance of credit, also kind of the knowledge and awareness of individuals who are part of the transfer process, but even outside of the transfer process, if they're aware of it. So I think once you do the self-assessment and you have the results, you take that results and you have a conversation with those key stakeholders that basically said, this is what we've identified. So you could do that with transfer, you could do that with prior learning assessment, but you don't know what you don't know. And so I think really kind of doing that self-examination to see where you're at, and then where are the areas of improvement, and engaging the key stakeholders in that process to become a more transfer friendly institution and transfer receptive institution.
I can chime in here regarding transfer receptive culture or transfer sending culture. How does your institution have transfer as a high institutional priority, right? And the institution-wide data collection around that may have to be very localized to begin with, right? What does financial aid do? What does testing do? What does in California, it's EOP&S, right? What do different service areas do in relation to promoting or supporting transfer? And then on the receiving side, what does the university do to prioritize transfer students within different academic departments? Is there information on the website that is specific for transfer students? Is there information in orientation and recruitment materials that is specific to transfer students, right? So really doing a transfer inventory similar to the self-analysis can really help on both ends, on both institutions, kind of creating a baseline for what is our transfer commitment and where can we improve. But knowing that it's really hard to cast that net super wide to begin with. That's what I'm learning at my own institution. And that we may have to do smaller discussions with particular units to begin with.
This question is near and dear to my heart because I was the director. I was the inaugural director of transfer at a community college several years ago, and I think that one of the things that's helpful, and one of my mentors told me this, and it's like anytime you're trying to get something off the ground and you're trying to build support. And you're in conversations with people, one of the most important things you can do anytime you face a little bit of resistance is to link everything back to the mission. Link everything back to the mission of the institution. What does the institution say it is? What does the institution say it's doing? And if you can couch the work that you're doing in those terms, it's hard for people to argue against the mission of the institution. So that can become, if you're familiar with that, if you become familiar with that, you may have some, you may be able to make some more headway, especially initially because people are trying to figure out what the heck you're doing in the first place. But,
yeah, and I did want to add one more comment to that, and it goes back to a previous comment that I made in the chat, is really also kind of leading with student voice. And understanding, their perceptions, their awareness, and their satisfaction. It just boggles the mind, and it surprises me that so many institutions won't survey their transfer students because they really don't want to hear from transfer students. They want to really rely just on data, and that's great. But without student voice, you can't do the pivots and the points of evolution or the improvements that really will make a bigger impact. So while orientations are great and first year experiences are great for transfer students, they'll tell you what's not working. They'll tell you what the pain points are. And so you have to really take those and challenge your processes, challenge your policies in order to make improvements and to be able to be that, transfer friendly institution and improve the student experience.
Wonderful, wonderful. I think we have time for just a couple more questions. Just a quick one here. Any recommendations this is from Rebecca Sigelko at BHCC. Are there any recommendations for improving the transfer experience for students coming from a quarter-based semester or a quarter-based system into a semester credit system?
I almost want to pass that to Rose. The only thing I would say though is that was always the hardest piece around evaluation because the credit hours were different. So a lot of times what that translated to was the student having to take some additional courses just to meet either the objectives of the course or the credit hour requirement, but I would assume that's a huge opportunity for some PLA or competency-based education related to just demonstrating that the learning outcome is still achieved, right? I see some nod heads, so I'm gonna say yes, that was a good answer, and I'm gonna pass it to Rose.
Well, and I would also add that, I go out and probably people probably recognize my name because I go out to national listservs and I ask questions, right? And I try to identify what's working, best practices, what's working, especially when it's the acceptance of credit and trying to figure out solutions, really out of the box solutions. And one thing that I think really kind of irks me is the fact that when doing the evaluation of transfer credit, it doesn't have to be exact. It has to be comparable enough that we know that students are going to be successful in their next level courses. And so really kind of moving away from the buckets and looking more towards program outcomes and competencies, right? So really trying to, change or create a model so that it doesn't have to be the exact one for one, but trying to create those, like Kimberly said, the assessments and models that are going to meet students where they're at, and just kind of moving away from this traditional formulas of credit acceptance, when it should be the bigger picture of what does the student bring with us, and then how can we provide the new learning that complements that.
Great, thank you. I see that we are at time. So I would like to thank all of you. We'd like to thank all of you for being here today and for listening to us. We enjoyed sharing with you. All of us are listed in the attendees directory, and all of us. I know that there are still several questions left in the chat. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. We are happy to answer as best we can. But again, on behalf of my esteemed colleagues here, thank you for listening to us, and we're glad to be here. We will see you in some of the other sessions, and I will hand this back to Emily.